Hello! Today we have Dario Nardi with us, and we're going to talk about the brain and type and those kind of things. About a month ago, I was at his lab or office or what we should call it and got a brain scan. And we hope that today we will illustrate some differences between brain and type and development and how maybe trait typology is not even a thing. Yeah, or something like that. When I was visiting you, you mentioned a good example of 3 people working at the company. Do you remember that thing?
Yes, I do. Yeah, you want me to say a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I've worked with maybe a dozen different teams, and these could be anywhere from like 3 people to 9 or 10 people. And it's always interesting to see, how their brains are similar or different. And of course, we look at other demographics too, like nationality, sex, age, what they're doing in their profession, all of training, all of that. Type too, of course. And this team was 3 people who they were just within a year or two in terms of the same age. They had been working at the company, I think it was for 16 years. They were in the same role, so they were in human resources training. They were actually trained to be interchangeable. That was the goal and this was like a big Scandinavian company. And so they were using similar models. Also, type-wise, they were all within one letter of each other pretty much. There was ENFJ, ESFJ, and ENFP. So they had a number of things in common. The same nationality, same kind of background, training. They did the same work, and that's what's important every day. Like 5 days a week for 15, 16 years. And what I found was really not entirely surprising, but it was really striking. Because usually in teams, you'll see some teams are very diverse, usually not, but they often are, especially if they're new teams. A lot of teams have differentiated into 2 different, like specialist to generalist kind of things, where the manager and maybe 1 or 2 other people, like in marketing or whatever it is, are generalists, and then like the computer programmers or like whatever are going to be specialists. But no, these 3 guys, when I looked at the brain wiring, they were almost identical. So there's 2 things we can look at in the brain that really pop out. One is just how they're using the brain in the lab, like which regions are more or less active, and how they respond to different activities that I give them over the course of an hour. And that's important to know. I give them the same kind of protocol that they go through. It is an hour's worth of time, so that we see many different things. The tasks are pretty diverse. And the brain wiring, though, is the second thing. So there's like an analytical technique. You take the brain data from the lab, you feed it into a computer program, and it discovers what are the underlying networks that are there. And this is not my invention. Like, this is something that's been around for like maybe 15 years in, sort of commonly used, using EEG technology. And, you can even find stuff on the internet about it. Coherence, or what's the other term? The Hebbian learning, so the network modeling, if you want to Google it. But there's, there's usually some variety between people. And if there's not very much, it's usually because it's like parent and child, and it's like the parent-child that like get along the closest. But here we have 3 people with almost identical brain wiring. And that brain wiring, what is it telling us? It's telling us something that's from, how does it come about? Well, they say neurons that fire together are wired together, and wiring only happens because of years of habit. So we're getting a look at the developed self, and their developed self was like 98% the same. I'm talking about like R value that's there, and that's in statistical analysis. And I'm like, wow, like how is it that their brains are so similar? It's like this connection here. These 2 regions are working like this, and these 5 regions are working in concert over here. And then there's another one, like it's 3 different regions, and those are working together really strongly. Of course, they weren't identical. That would be like crazy. But they really were more than 95% similar, at least in the top quartile, so the top 25% of brain connections. I think if we dig deeper, then we'll see also other stuff. They wouldn't be quite as similar. But in those favorite regions, that's what we see. And it's like, how do people end up so similar? It's because we're not assessing like something that's, like just purely the personality or purely skills or purely the context, what's happening, purely culture, sex, whatever it is. Each of those things is just a contributing factor. And what the brain imaging shows is the developed self. And their developed self, they were trained to be interchangeable, and their brains are interchangeable. There was one or two things that were different. Like one guy had some activity here that was really, really low, and it turns out he actually had 3 concussions over the past few years from skiing accidents. So there were some differences between them, but it was a beautiful reminder that, beyond what we'd like to think is the nature part, like genetics and whatever is going to happen, I guess, in the womb or something like that, that actually the nurture part is really important. So 2 people who can identify with the same personality profile could have different careers or whatever. They could have various, their brains are going to be different just because they're in very different careers. And the opposite could be true too. But when they're in the same career and they have very similar personality profile, and they come from the same culture and the same sex, and within just a few years of each other, and all 3 have like similar family life and education, then it's not a surprise. This is what we get. In fact, if we didn't get that, I'd be suspicious.
Yeah. Okay, so you are to some extent trying to link it to, for example, MBTI, socionics, Jungian typology. Which one of those 3 do you think would fit more with your approach? Is it more of a Jungian thing, or introversion, extroversion, or what is it?
Yeah. Well, we can break it down in different ways. One is that in neuroscience, or we'll say neuropsychology, that introversion, extroversion is already established, is something that people accept and is there not just as a trait that's measurable based on people's external behavior, but in the brain. There are networks that preferentially handle sensory input coming in. So if like I hear and see stuff, does it feed in a circuit that goes immediately to the front of the brain where I'm making decisions and doing executive stuff? Or does it go through a loop that goes to the back of the brain and processes with things like memory and like each other, like, the person's mulling over it, checking, and then it goes to the front. Of course, that process takes longer.
Okay.
Then there are other things that are not just brain wiring, the pathways. There's things like, is the sensory input coming in, is the person like high gain or low gain? Like the information, does it sound really loud to one person and really quiet to another because of how the brain, like how it is against the brain's baseline of expectation? So there's some things like that that are just set, that we understand like are there, and that's good. In terms of some other dimensions of, in specific, I think we'll talk about type now, like the Jungian, like a sensing, intuiting, for example, or thinking, feeling, that there are some close analogs that are accepted generally in neuroscience, like as a person learns to differentiate and label objects in the environment, do they focus more of their attention on things like face recognition, or more on object recognition, things like a car makes and models, or animal types and subtypes, versus species and whatever within that, like songbirds or bird watchers must have an amazingly dedicated memory and recognition for that. Or are they doing more people focus with voices and faces and that kind of thing? So I'm not saying, a person isn't going to be a mix of those, because everybody, every functional adult that does face recognition, object recognition, but where is the bias? So that's like the one part. And then the other part, to answer your question, my sense is now, if we want to talk about personality, we need to talk about development. Like they go hand in hand, which suggests to me that really the Jungian approach maybe not like full-blown like anima, animus, shadow, like all of these psychotherapeutic concepts, but at least in a functional sense, that people have different, functions, the brain functions in different ways. So I'm talking cognitive science now, and that we have biases that we develop, and that we develop those preferentially. And some of that bias is going to be because of environment, and some of it will be because of later or earlier environment, some of it because of like genetics or hormones or whatever it is, nature and nurture. But that's not to dismiss the other stuff. So there's a wonderful, the Minnesota identical twins study. So these are identical twins raised separately. They're talking about, thousands and thousands of people, longitudinal study. They were given the MBTI, not some random thing on the internet, but like the actual like validated MBTI instrument. And the contribution that was determined to be, innate, in other words, genetic, was between 40 and 60% for each of the type dimensions, which was actually the same as it was for 5-factor model. So if something like sensing, intuiting turns out to be, I don't remember which dimensions were more like 40 and which ones were more like the 60% contribution, but that's actually what we expect. That something that's like a really strong factor for a person is going to be sort of close to half and half. And if something like sensing, intuiting is 50% genetic, let's just say, around it, that's telling us we're assessing something real. We also need to know that's not the only thing. Like the glass is half full, half empty, however you want to say it. It's there as something real. With socionics, I think that's more challenging because it also has like other aspects to it. Like it has these quadra and like relates to society and like the interrelationships with other people. I don't know what kind of, how we could really assess that nicely. I think there are some parts of socionics which are really promising. And I think it's great that there's just a counterpoint to the MBTI version of type that evolved in America. And I think that's important to say, that remember that MBTI was something that evolved from a couple of people in America to serve specific need, and that there are other takes on Jung's work.
Yeah, the way I see it, socionics adds a lot more nuance. So I see it as more useful, but that's just personally. Maybe MBTI has more, like it serves its purpose in the workplace more than it does on a personal level. One thing that came to mind now is that I've seen you talk about how different regions correlate with certain ways of thinking or certain types. Even if a person, for example, works HR for 20 years, will you still be able to recognize it as most likely this type than another type? Or might it alter to the extent of looking like something else? Or can you not really necessarily recognize what the person is type-wise based on looking at their connections?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I want to back up slightly and say, in terms of the functional contribution of different brain regions, that's not just me. Somebody can go to Wikipedia and look at what are called Brodmann areas. A person can go look at the Human Connectome Project, which is all online in the public, and see that there are definitely, by the way, open a neuroscience textbook, and see that there are these different regions of the brain which contribute. The brain is plastic, and every task involves multiple regions. So we have that level of complexity there, and it's not something simple like this is like the, I don't know, intuiting part of the brain, and here is the sensing part or something like that. Like it's not that way. It really, if the way I do it is I break it down to what the EEG machine can differentiate, which is 20 different regions. And how do they impact people in terms of skills, but also in terms of like emotions, the personality, that kind of thing. Because, there are lots of different studies out there. We can correlate stuff. I did really one in-depth thing with we'll talk about ENFPs to answer your question. So we have over 30, I think now we have over 40 ENFP, like 42, 43 ENFPs. And how do we know who they're ENFPs? I think that's a question for later in our conversation. And so we recorded things like age and sex and career area. And in the career area, we found that really we could group them into two. I mean, we can group careers more finely, but the results, even across 40 people, didn't seem to be that huge. It seemed like more there really was meaningfully two career areas. One of them is more, like STEM, so science, technology, engineering, math, also business, things that require sort of linear analytical thinking. We might say left brain thinking, but that's a metaphor. Then the other category was like the arts, human resources, some kind of like, and that means anything. So interacting with people, you could be social worker, you could be like childcare, like whatever it is. The arts, some kind of physical stuff as well. So things that are more like people oriented and maybe nonlinear in nature. Art is not necessarily people oriented, but it has a nonlinearity to it. And then we looked at age and sex and these other things too. And what was interesting is that when you really break these all down, like between male and female ENFPs, and that's all I was dealing with. There was no like a transgender ENFP study or anything like that, because those people are actually incredibly rare. And here we go. And so I got these different results, and I realized that really there's almost like two versions of ENFP, and there are things that contribute to whether you're going to be more one version or the other. And one version is going to be, you're younger, you're male, you're in like a science or business, like a sort of more linear kind of thing, and that skews one way. And I want to use that word skews. Okay, this is not rule-based thinking. This is like statistical, what I'm talking about. Then there's another direction, was more the arts and like human-oriented stuff, older, more likely to be female. And so that's a different direction. And the wiring looks pretty different. And a person could be like male artist. And in fact, there was like more male artists than female artists by far, like 3-1, something like that. So they would be in that like second creative, we'll say like a nonlinear category. The term in neuroscience would be more like analytical versus holistic kind of thing. And so there was like, maybe we develop potentially in these two different ways. We learn how to express our type, and there are factors that contribute to that. And what I found is that sex was a big contributor statistically, never deterministic, because you can never give me two brains and say like which one is male or female. Like honestly, I don't know. Would not put money down for that. But statistically, and that's something that's when people are younger. But that disappears by the time in the 55 plus cohort, then that disappears. So sex is not something significant, in the later part of life. That, by the way, is not a surprise, like to any neuroscience person. It's not, it might be like we need more data or like whatever it is, but that's developmentally, it's not a surprise from what we know about a ton of things. Career obviously doesn't have much impact at the beginning with the young people, like 15 to 25, but it has when you look at people in their 30s, 40s, the ENFPs, like a career starts to have a big impact. If they're doing like, say something like, okay, even cinematography, are they doing it in a way where they're in front of an analog camera and their role is to be like more creative? Or are they sitting in Photoshop, or we'll say like a Final Cut or something like that software, and they need to be like have this like precision mindset, this analytical mindset. So there's a little bit of digging that goes on to learn about their career and their activities, but that's what tends to dominate in the middle of life. And then I found that, it's interesting in that later part of life, actually the career almost doesn't matter in the 55 plus, because everybody just sort of converges, all the ENFPs at least, to this particular like ENFP brain that's 55 plus. And there are some other things like culture. I won't get into all of that. There are the cultural differences that are relevant when we compare like people from India versus Europe versus the US. The point is, each of these factors plays a role. Type plays a role throughout. Okay, type, I'm very happy I started with college students because I expected 18 to 25-year-olds are not going to have a huge amount of type development. And that, in fact, was the case. that most of the brain regions that are more active or wired are like very obviously supporting their type preferences. We'll talk about what that means. But actually other things like sex and age, environmental stuff also influence, and the influence in a way that's developmental. So you almost need to know the person's age and their career and their sex and some other things to say, yeah, this is probably the kind of brain that they're going to have. So the last part of the answer is about that, what I would say, the expression of type. So when I look at somebody, usually when we talk about favorite brain regions right now, like talking about when they come into the lab, not even the brain wiring, that what we see is like a half to 2/3 of the regions are going to be things that support their type preferences. And maybe 1/3 are going to be in the opposite direction. And I'm talking about just the average person. So let's say that average is like 35 years old or whatever. What does it mean, support the type preferences? Let's say a person has feeling preference. What supports that? Attention to voice tone and intention. Attention to body language. So we're talking about like some actually regions in the right hemisphere for vision and for hearing. Also a region more up in here that's about understanding emotion in a social context. Maybe also could be left hemisphere. Something it could be about talking and listening and communicating with people. It could be rapport building, which is based in mirror neurons in the left frontolateral area. And so those are the kind of things that support the feeling preference. When we talk, and a person with feeling preference is not necessarily going to have all of those. Okay, they're going to have like maybe one or two here, and then maybe, I don't know, something over here. Like something I discovered, this is not a surprise, men are more likely, at least the ENFP males, to have more strong visual skills than the female counterparts in terms of brain wiring. But we already know this from neuroscience, and whether this is from culture and upbringing, or whether this is, from genetics, like I have no idea. I have no opinion about that. I can't know. I'll leave that to other people. But there is this bias. And the same for thinking preference, like different ways that the brain engages in reasoning, and which of those is the person developed to aid in that. And again, those could be sensory-based, they could be abstract reasoning, logic, language-based versus visual spatial reasoning. And that's one of my pet peeves. I'll end my answer is this a little bit of confusion of equating language-based reasoning with thinking, which is not true. I think that comes from maybe too many NT types and sort of well-meaning NF types in the type community who equate language and thinking. They can be similar, but actually a lot of, I would say, what supports the thinking preference really well is visual-spatial thinking. Like thinking in terms of like visualizing a machine and how to manipulate the machine, and there are no words that are required. That's just like a little pet peeve of mine. In part also because the American school system, like academia, grossly, I think, overemphasizes language-based reasoning to its detriment of the students.
Okay, those things you say there, like a lot of the different regions can support both thinking and feeling preference. And at that point, like, how do you still find, how many types of brains are there? And does those differences disappear with age? But with people who are, let's say, older than 50, would they be more or less of their type?
Great question. Yeah, love the question. So to get to the first part of the question, because I'm only looking at 20 regions, and ideally we would be differentiating like more precisely with like 65 or 120 or 600, which may be fMRI, like a really good, or even actually EEGs now. There's some really good machines, expensive, but good. The good news is I have people complete a lot of different activities over the course of the hour. So it's not like a typical thing in brain imaging, at least with EEG, is 6 minutes with eyes closed, just sitting there, and then 6 minutes with eyes open. And some person even falsely accused me of just doing that at the beginning, and how could I tell about type? I'm like, I've never done that. I think that's great for a lot of applications, like looking, does a person have seizures or like whatever it is, but that's not what we're doing. I give them a ton of different activities that are specifically keys to like a different sensory modalities, different ways of thinking. And so I can look at which parts of the brain are active, not just in general for that person, but during specific activities that those would be relevant to. And the Human Connectome Project, which is fMRI based, but is international and very, very highly supported, that really shows that yes, people use regions of the brain that are actually relevant to the task at hand, which maybe not every person all the time. Yes, a person's mind can wander as they're doing something, but that's why we have an hour with them to capture stuff, and why every person has 2 to 5 minutes to complete a task instead of just 10 seconds or whatever it is, 1 minute. So if I look at some region, like let's say T3 actually. So this is like the anterior temporal area in the left hemisphere. T3 is the name of the sensor. That's involved with processing word content, like the actual words that I'm speaking, not how I say them, what I say. It's also involved in impulse control, specifically like pain and sexual impulses have been established. Those are things that it manages. And it's involved with music. So like the technical aspects of music, like pitch and, recognizing specific notes and so on. So if a person's very active there, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're just very talkative in paying attention to word content? Does it mean that actually they might be quiet, but they listen very carefully to the kinds of words that people are using? So that could be the difference between even say like ENTP and INTP. One is blah, 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 in a conversation, and the other one might just be sitting and listening and like really considering the words that are used and how they're being said. But it could be, say, ESTJ. And ESTJ they can be fairly talkative, and they generally have amazing impulse control. And then there could be a person of any type who just happens to be professionally trained musician. So how do I know which one is which? Well, I know because I'm having them do different activities, and I do debrief after. Not every activity, but if there's any kind of ambiguity, and at least for half of them, automatically we debrief. So when they listen to like 90 seconds or 2 minutes of music, I ask a question afterwards, and I even know from their intake sheet, like, are you trained in music? Or what feeling or visuals or whatever came to mind? What were you focusing on as you listened to the music? So just a simple question like that. And then, of course, there are other things that they do that are auditory. I don't give them opportunities for controlling pain impulses. That's probably not appropriate in terms of human subject research. There was one opportunity once, but the one is not a sample size. And I leave that to other people who've published papers already established that. So, but generally speaking, I'm able to differentiate, like within a region, like what was it that was actually, which of the 2, 3, 4 things was actually that region being used. So that's actually not an issue. When we dig deeper into that second part of the question, we want to know, now how did you say it?
As we age, do we become more or less of the type?
So, people within the same type are going to develop things that will help meet their practical needs and their psychological needs. Over the course of which is practical is like cultural, career, all of that. Psychological is like what does it even mean? And we haven't even defined the psychological yet. By the way, that's not defined. And people say personality types. And Jung didn't talk about personality types. He talked about psychological type. And by type, he didn't actually mean the word that it means in English. It's used the way we use it in English. He means like a pattern, or in this case, a functional preference. So he was actually inspired by mathematics. And the idea, if you've ever taken like calculus or analytical geometry, there's a function like y equals mx plus b. And that's, you can plug any kind of numbers into it. So that's what he meant by functions. Didn't mean like specific behaviors at all. In fact, he very explicitly said that we're not talking about that. So people practically have to develop certain skills to express themselves in their environment. So I have this abstract introverted intuiting, or maybe for you, introverted thinking. And over the course of, from child to old age, I find ways to express that abstract function. And those could be interested for NI, what is it? It could be interest in meditation and spirituality. It could be interest in technology and innovation. It could be, expressing itself in any number of ways that somehow meets this psychological underlying function that's there. And we haven't defined them yet, but we can do that in a later question if you want. When people get older, what does it mean? Does it mean that if we look at all the ENFPs and we see that, they 55 plus, they're really converging? And that doesn't mean every person converges. It's just statistically they converge. Does that mean that they lose their type and they become any type? Or does it mean that somehow they're becoming the fulfillment of their type? And those are two I think the answer depends on what our assumption is about what type is. So Jung intended that the person's type is not just preferences, but includes their non-preferences, because he was always concerned with polarities. There's the tension of opposites that's present. So as I develop introverted intuiting a lot, I necessarily, in some way, am developing a tension with extroverted sensing. And that may have opportunities to come out in my life in healthy ways, in unhealthy ways, whatever it is, for both of them. Dominant function can be used in an unhealthy way too, overused, whatever. And so there's this tension, and he saw that that is the pattern of the person. So if we define type not as traits or as rules about the person's behavior, but as something that's systemic, that means it's always the organism within the environment. We think of ants and trees, larger forest environment, and they interrelate. The same, a squirrel takes a nut, eats the nut or whatever, doesn't eat the nut. Then later the nut, if it survives, becomes an apple tree. The apple tree creates more apples for more squirrels. I define psyche as something that's systemic. The psyche is not just in the mind necessarily, or even in the whole nervous system. It necessarily involves the person's environment. So these functions that Jung came up with, they were always in the vein of socionics. They were interpersonal in nature. Automatically, they have to be there, or at the very least, we can say systemic. Interpersonal doesn't mean there has to be a person right in front of me. I could be a lone hunter in the woods, but it's still me interacting with the environment. So it's not just this boop, 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 computer-like a function that's playing there, and it's certainly not specific behaviors. But the fact is, we have, we share this particular kind of environment. And so people in similar types are going to tend statistically to develop a particular skills, because that's what's offered to them. That's what's going to be working more often for them. And I believe when they get older, that if we say we're taking a systemic approach, that the person is developing, that they find ways to reconcile opposites. And this doesn't even need to be about personality. It can be something about marriage. Human beings, it seems are not 100% naturally monogamous. But we're close enough that we end up developing this tension between monogamy, not monogamy, monogamy, not monogamy. And we find ways to reconcile those. And those could be artistic, and they could be through friendships and career. There's in terms of age, we choose to be wild when we're young, and then we get married when we're older. We find ways to reconcile. So Jung would be very concerned, how do we develop? And so if we take a developmental approach, I see that the person converging, or at least the ENFPs converging later in life, that actually reflects development. And if they remain very one-sided, they look very, the person who's 70-year-old ENFP, and they have a very one-sided result. It's not towards that conversion. I want to know, how have they managed to reconcile opposites? If sex differences tend to sort of merge and disappear, and I would say actually they do merge to some extent because there are characteristics of each that come together in that final older picture. And that points to something developmental, and we know there's like a hormonal reason for that underneath. If the person has found other ways to converge in the career and whatnot, in 50 years, people have lots of opportunities, to change careers, or even within the same career, express it in different ways, go from something technical to managerial, whatever it is. That I view it, if we say we're going to have a systems definition, that psyche is something systemic, then necessarily that similarity in age is a positive sign, and it says the person is well-rounded and has developed.
Okay, but you can still tell it's an ENFP.
There are patterns which seem to survive with ENFPs. One of those is the constellation of pattern recognition around the body language and voice tone. I think ENFPs get in a lot of non-verbal, or we say like non-digital data about people. Like they're sort of their mirror image cousin, the ESTP. They get this data and they use that in order to form a picture of the person they're with, like a psychological profile. I mean, ENFPs do psychological profiling very nicely. There's this other pattern, which is a whole brainstorm pattern, which shows as every region firing together in sync with every other region. That's not necessarily a practical thing. It can be great. It's great for creativity. The example I use is like a check comes into a company with the normal company, which can be typical person. The check goes to accounting because that's where it's supposed to go. But for ENFP, every person in the company gets to look at the check. And I'm not saying every ENFP starts out with a strong starburst pattern, brainstorming pattern. That's not true. And culture will also have an effect on that. But by the time we get to the synthetic picture at the end, the developed picture, like 55 plus, we're going to see that. And for most of them, ENFPs, I mean, when I do see that starburst pattern, I'm like, there's only 3 or 4 things at play. One is they have really strong intuiting preference, which usually means dominant intuiting, like ENFP or INTJ, but not always. They're in highly creative profession, like you have to perform live, extemporaneous in some way. So there's performance that's there, creative performance, or they're sensing person who's left-handed. Those are pretty much like the 3 things that I find. And so then that obviously excludes a lot of people. And then you combine some other stuff that's like characteristic of ENFP. So yeah, if you gave me information like this person, the different factors like male, female, their career category, their age, their cultural background, and then their brain imaging map, and ask me what type are they, then I'm like, okay, now we can put down money. And then there are a few cases where I'd be like, okay, say ENTP, but the person is a psychotherapist. I don't mean like an entrepreneur who's interested in human resources stuff and like people technology. I mean like is a working psychotherapist and they have ENTP preferences. They necessarily, and say they're 45 years old, they necessarily have stuff that looks like ENFP, but then they still share the same dominant function. And so I do believe there are areas where we can't pin down 100%. But then, it's always been my attitude when doing type assessment, and the type assessments I've developed, which are actually instruments, not like me, just like Q&A. I look at the top 3 types and then let the person sort for themselves. And it's not unusual. I found with all the people I've worked with over the years that about 75% of people can settle on one type pretty easily. 20% are often torn between 2 or 3 different types. And they know why they're even torn, because they see like my career has pushed me here, but like maybe I was more like this when I was younger. And then there's always that 5%, which I'm not concerned with. That's like the weird person. And there's margins in every system. And there's also individuals who are exceptions. And then, there's noise in the system. So I'm not bothered. But what I would say is if I get to play a game and I put money down in a betting game repeatedly, then yes, I can consistently say like, yeah, I think I can play that game and say this person is ENFP or at least dominant intuiting.
Okay, I've seen that you've said earlier that there's between 8 and 12 kinds of brains. And when there's 16 types, are there some types where you can't put money down?
Yeah, so there's two questions there. So the one of them I know you asked before and I forgot, and that's so I'm just looking at brain imaging in terms of the wiring that's there. There we go. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So it's what is it that we're looking at? So we're seeing the connectivity of different regions, and this means regions that fire together. And they don't need to be adjacent to each other, because at least the working understanding is that the thalamus in the limbic system coordinates how different parts of the brain fire simultaneously. The red regions are strong connections. The black ones also strong, but not quite as strong. All of these reflect like the top eighth of the connections that could be there. Gray and yellow also strong, but again, like going down through that top eighth. So this is painting a picture of a person here in terms of their favorite brain regions in how they're working together. There are things that consistently we want to see, like the connectivity between the left and right prefrontal areas, our executive regions, our CEOs, like those need to be strong. Here we see these are strong. Same visual regions at the bottom there, the visual regions need to be working well. Otherwise, please don't get in driving a car or something. Or maybe it doesn't show up that way. It could be like a dyslexia or something like that. Maybe that might be the cause. Some kind of connectivity. So the point is, the question is like, how many diagrams are there? So now we've seen an example. Scroll back to the previous page where there's like 3 little examples.
Yeah. There we have those.
Yeah, there we are. Okay. So we see 3 examples here, and I chose 3 that were, the one on the left, I'll tell you, was a European male. I can just tell from the brain wiring, like, because for some reason men from Europe have like, not women from Europe, or others that just have some particular patterns. And then we see some other stuff going on. How many, if we were to try and do some kind of analysis to say that there are these different networks and how do the different networks, the topologies sort, how many topologies would we have? Well, first of all, every person is different. And as I look here, I can't say, well, yes, the one on the far left is like a certain pattern that's like one of, say, 12 different patterns. The one in the middle is, again, like a particular pattern where we see quite a bit around the outside of the neocortex and towards the frontier, but not much else. And then the one on the far right is just, if you look very carefully in gray, you'll see it has a starburst pattern, but on top of that is just sort of like this chaos of lines. But if we were going to sort of do our best to sort these into a typology of topologies, networks, how many would we have? Well, I've never analyzed all of my data thoroughly. So I don't want to say like a hard number, and who knows, maybe the hard number is actually 16, or maybe, when it's all said and done, it's 5 or whatever it is. But towards my broad counting, it tends to be like 8 to 10, maybe 12 different patterns. One that's like mostly halo around the outside, one that's like heavily from like mid onward to the front, that's almost always some kind of like strong extrovert, like extroverted extrovert. One that's from like the middle back, that's going to be like strong introvert. There's people occasionally who are like strong right or left or right hemisphere. Not so much with Americans, but say for people from India, I tend more to see like a left hemisphere stuff. Then there are people who are front and the back, but not in the middle. Hello, ENFPs, it's very common with them. There are people who have really strong starburst pattern. Then people who have like secondary starburst pattern, but like their stuff layered on top. There are people who have like a whole zigzag that's very cross hemisphere and a lot of diagonal lines. I think maybe I've only seen those with women. Which is actually not really surprised when we look at like slight gender differences that tend to show up statistically among men and women in fMRI studies. So those are to name a few. There are more that like there's one where like mostly the stuff is in the middle and maybe connecting the auditory. So it's auditory kinesthetic. So that's like ESFP or something like that. But that's not like a super extroverted ESFP. That's more like a very sensory driven ESFP. So there are these different topologies, and I can't say exactly how many there are, but I would say roughly, let's round up and we'll say that there's a dozen. If we ask like for a particular type, let's say ENFP, how much variety does there tend to be out of those 12? Well, 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 would be, and like the other 8 will not show up with ENFPs. Like even out of 40, there are definitely patterns that have never ever shown up with ENFP. Whereas say ENFJ, there is a particular pattern which is like the front half forward. So this is the very sort of directly extroverted ENFJ. Simply doesn't show up with ENFP, period. Okay. Like no ENFP has that.
Do you still need the chat?
No, that's good. You can come back now. I think people got the idea. Yeah.
Okay, so the pattern is almost like a besides the point when it comes to type. If there's like 12 different ones and 4 of them can be an ENFP.
Well, I could venture a little thing. I would remind that in the archetype system, there are 12 archetypes, and that each type is not tied to a specific archetype, but tends to have around 3 or 4 different archetypes commonly associated with that type.
Okay.
So it could be that the brain is actually expressing the archetype.
Maybe, but another thing is that
maybe. Yes, and I'm on board with the word maybe. Yes.
No, but the thing about the archetypes or whatever is that was just based on one person's observations, and if you look into the extroverted thinking type, it looks a lot like an ESTJ, So they are formed by what he would most naturally see more of,
Yes, and I would say with ESTJ. A common pattern is from like ENFJ is the front forward. Not like exclusive, they're not like identical, but that's like your stereotypical extroverted only, almost, ESTJ. With some other few things here and there, but that's basically it. Then there's another ESTJ who's going to be a lot more like, I want to say like the cluster is in the center of the brain and they tend to have some supporting stuff around it. They're still extroverted. Those people tend to be a little bit older, but it's more about the use of the senses and that they're based in sensation. And so that's a way to look at it. Like they have really good connectivity in those central parietal areas that are involved with visual, spatial reasoning and body movement and that kind of thing. There's another version which is going to be more just like left hemisphere analytical. So there's a difference in terms of how they're expressing their type. And then I would say that those 3 patterns are actually like the 3 predominant patterns, and none of them are shared with ENFP in that particular case.
Okay, but is it like there's just like 4 types within each pattern kind of? For example, all the extroverted feeler types will kind of tend to look similar, like that example you mentioned with 3 extroverted feelers who started to look very much the same. Mm-hmm. So it goes with that kind of focus. So it kind of ends up with Jungian dichotomies almost.
Well, I would say in that case, I think it's important with the terminology. When we say extroverted feeler, we mean having a preference for extroverting and having a preference for feeling.
Yes.
Because the ENFP and the ESFJ actually are functionally otherwise pretty different. Although they have similar interaction style.
Yeah, because I saw that Abraham, when he got me, he had like a big black starburst, and he's a sensor.
Yes, he is, and that's one big thing that differentiates the STJs from the SFJs. So we want to keep in mind that it is interesting. I think like not enough attention has been given to SJs in the type community, period. I think some of that is because the SJs, especially STJs, tend to self-type really, really well. ISTJs tend to know their ISTJs. Maybe intuiting types feel like, oh, the SJs are boring. Like maybe there's not much interesting going on. Linda Behrens, in working on interaction styles, said no, they actually have opposite interaction styles, the STJs and SFJs. And what I found is really interesting is that the starburst pattern actually shows up quite commonly with the SFJs. Mostly, I think, with ISFJ, because a lot of ISFJ, in my study specifically, which is biased, a lot of the ISFJs, the majority for sure, are in the arts in some way. Musicians specifically. Not all of them are musicians, but that's a very, very common theme with ISFJs. Even like my tenant ISFJ is a conductor, or a composer. So there's that, the creative quality that produces the starburst. And then with ESFJ, they have extroverted intuiting. The model is that that's something that comes up. Intuiting is third for them. And so if we're looking at people who are like, I would say beyond the like 15 to 20 years old, that we're not going to be surprised. And I honestly think the third function starts developing in the mid-teens. Even before that, but the person starts even becoming aware of their third function. Oh, I have this, like, INTJs are aware that they have a moralistic, like, emotional side in their mid-teens. They don't like it, they don't know what to do with it, but they're aware that they have it. And so even then I wouldn't be surprised. So that's why I say, like, a developmental approach. SFJs quite often have that starburst pattern. I think some of it is because I tend to have a lot of creative SFJs. I need to get more blue collar, like craft oriented, ones that are doing something that's not in the creative arts. But it's, again, it's that there are these different brain wiring topologies, and every type tends to gravitate, regardless of age or whatever, towards 3 or 4 of those. And then definitely not, like, there's a whole set with like 4 or 6 of them that you will never find a single person that shows that other pattern. So that's when I say, like, it's statistical, and if you do a repeat test, I'm willing to put money down on it. And I think a lot of it is because they are, as you suggested, meeting a particular need in a particular way. So like if a person is an extrovert, and by that I mean, has a preference for the extroverting function, more likely that they're going to have the front half of the brain more well-wired. But if a person is ISTJ and they've been a manager for 30 years, interacting with people all the time, necessarily they're going to develop some of that too. And does that mean over the 30 years it's not just career, but it's also their own development? Or is it like, some people argue like, no, they're just using more extroverted thinking. Or is it that they're actually using like their inner ENFP? I don't know. Then we're not treating the model as reality. We're treating the model as like a way to explain things. And then I think we should go with what is the best, like, simplest explanation. And I haven't arrived at that point yet in my research.
Yeah, but is this like the one approach you're running for your research, or are you also looking into different angles than just the EEG?
Oh, well, I'm definitely very focused on EEG. I have other things that I assess, like different protocols, like I've looked at meditation, like before, during, and after for meditation and yoga and that kind of thing, like body-mind practices. So I have other questions that are like not related to type, that revolve, or even things like around couples, like do couples become more similar to each other the longer they've been together? The answer seems like yes, but again, that's statistical. So, in that hierarchy of like rule-based, and I think there are a lot of people who want type to be like a set of rules. I'm like, that ain't gonna happen. Like, do they want it to be statistical? Yes. Is statistics messy? Yes. I say thank God that it's at a statistical and even above that systemic level, because it's really where we want to be. Is like, statistics is not the end. Statistics is like mid-level analysis. Truly understanding involves like a systemic understanding, where we have these different factors and we understand how the factors are contributing to what role they're playing in the system. So there is a little bit of this messiness, and it's there. And in terms of my interests, I would say, it started out with what is EEG and how do I use this? That's like the first 6 months. Then there were several years of gathering data, and around 2009 or 10, I had the impression that actually type and brain imaging, like type did not show up. It's like, sorry, it turns out type is useful construct, but it's not, like, it doesn't relate. And then I spent like 6 months just doing statistics, which was an awful process because I didn't have tons of patience for it. And it turned out, no, actually there is, like, type is definitely a big statistical contributor to the results. And since then, I've continued to look, but bringing in the other, variables that I've assessed. I mean, it's just people filling out the demographics form, basically, and asking, like, what's going on. And that's where I've arrived at this philosophy that, personality, or we'll say psychology, is not something static. There's this thing called psychology, the person's psychology, the psyche. And it's not just the personality, because this personality is just like either a slice of now, if you're, one view, or you can say like it's a pattern, but it's fixed. That's a different view. But I say it needs to be developmental. And I've just, even though it's a little bit more nuanced approach, I believe that the Jungian approach with the functions and understanding that the functions is not like a set constellation, but in fact something that we develop dynamically with respect to our environment over our lifespan, that is the really interesting way to go. And I would say I'm really driven by, one is, are we getting some interesting results that we can translate into something useful for people? What does the data actually show that's useful too? I'm not too much of a theory person anymore with type. I do believe, however, type is still useful. And it's the most useful when we take a developmental approach. And I believe on the internet, most of the people involved with type, who run, and this is going to include yourself, is like they're millennials or even younger than that. And they're really, really focused on, like, maybe there's like 512 types, but let's not talk about development. Or there's like 64 types, but let's not talk about development. And I'm like, let's maybe actually, we can just even talk about 4 types, but let's talk about development. And I think it's very relevant for me. After 50 years, I have a sense of like, development matters. And I know all the older people in the type community who've been around since the 70s. Some of them are dead, so I don't know them anymore, but sadly we've lost them. But there's a lot of wisdom there. And the majority of that wisdom said, like, development is really, really where the action is and where the meat is. And I look forward to, now with the younger generation coming up, give it 20 years, and we will have people who remain interested in type. There's like a sorting process, and they're using the new technology that's available, like neuroscience, and they will finally be interested in development. And that's something I'm excited about, that maybe I'm contributing, showing like, here's a way we can do that.
Okay, but it almost sounds like you to some extent see it as an older generation has disappeared, and now it's kind of reawakening with a larger group of people.
Yeah. And I would say that there's, there are type organizations, professional organizations, which have mediocre to small web presence. They include generally hundreds of people who have decades. Each person has decades of experience. We're often trained by the original people, whether that was David Kiersey or even Isabel Myers, more likely Kathy and Peter Myers, other people, Linda Behrens, Roger Pierman, Danielle Poirier. Like, I could go on and give like a huge list of people. Margaret and Gary Hartzler. There are these people who are in their 60s and 70s, 80s even, who have, like, many of them therapists originally. Yves DeLunas, another amazing like psychotherapist, family system stuff. And there is this group, but they're not, like, for the most part, really web savvy. And there are people who are working at a level where they're working in corporations or with like high level clients, and they don't have time to sit around and like do a blog or whatever it is. Like, that's not their inclination. So that hasn't happened. Like there definitely is like a technology changed the landscape. And it's a shame, because I think what happened is that as the internet blossomed, there was a lot of material that the older generation like didn't put on the internet. Because, books, wouldn't you just go to the bookstore and buy a book, or go to like a training and spend $1,200 or $3,500 or whatever and get a training? And so I think that I feel, okay, my sense is that there's, as I jump between like verbs, that there's a lot of younger people on the internet who don't realize that like there's a huge thing called the Milo database, which has thousands of references for type under the Center of Application for Psychological Type. There's such a thing as like the MBTI manual. Like I've encountered people who are like, oh, big, and they're typing all this stuff and they're like on Personality Cafe or whatever, and they've never heard of the MBTI manual. I'm like, that's just like, I mean, like, how did this happen? So there's like a knowledge chasm that opened up. And it's unfortunate. And there are people who are bridging the gap. Personality Hacker, I think, is a great example where they're appealing mostly to younger people. They're aware of the older generation and all of the knowledge that's there. They're offering practical trainings and stuff that's on the web and in person. So I see that there's like some bridging stuff happening. And I'm trying to do some of the bridging stuff. But even then, I mostly don't put myself out there. Like, I'm just too busy, honestly. One, working and enjoying life. Because I'm not actually type obsessed, believe it or not. It's like one of like a dozen things in my toolbox. And like I could talk about NLP. And I think NLP is an amazing framework, and you don't need type at all. And NLP is fantastic by itself. There's other things that are really significant. And that's but I do have a sense that it's there, and I really would love more rigor and a knowledge of the past and what's come before. Because there's a lot of reinvention of the wheel, and there's a lot of speculation like, oh, I'm going to have my new system, but I'm going to use the type letters. And that just creates a lot of confusion. I've had people come to me literally like, I've been typed by like these 3 different experts, and they all give me completely different types. I'm ENTJ, another one says I'm ESFP. I'm like, well, they have different definitions. And I'm like, if you define them differently, and if you're only using one model, which is a methodological mistake when you're dealing with 3-dimensional people, but you're using 1-dimensional model, you're automatically like the person is handicapped. The analyst is handicapped.
What do you mean by one-dimensional model?
Well, I don't mean that the model itself is like, like just hopelessly oversimplified. What I mean is that like when I do type assessment, like seriously with the person, I'm thinking about like the Jungian functions. That's there. That's a set of data point or set of data points. There's also temperament. Temperament is actually a different model. It's not just like you group the type 4 different ways. Temperament is a model of motivation. It is what's called a conative model, whereas the Jungian functions, they could be treated as psychological model, but what happens usually they're treated as a cognitive model. And cognitive and conative are very different. You get different pieces of information. One is about needs and values. The other one is about mental processes. Then we add in interaction styles. That's an affective model. And that, again, brings in new data points. So if we just use interaction styles, there are 4. And we just use temperament, there are 4. And there are 4 interaction styles within each temperament. You can arrive at 16 types, and you never looked at functions at all. And that's the way to go about it. Then there's the 4-letter code. Then there's this idea that each of the 16 types is a unique pattern, and that we can give a person like descriptions to read that are not constructed mechanically, but are woven organically from, say, interviews with real people of those types, or verified of those types. So I can think of really like 5 different, and then the person takes the MBTI. And then they do a self-assessment process around type and the preferences or whatever it is. But easily we have always at least like 3 different ways to sort of triangulate where is the person. Like many times I find a person is sorting between 2 different types. And why is this? Because there's some dimension that they're seeing in common that's very, very strong in them. Like INTJ and ISTP that person has really, really strong pragmatism. Pragmatism is not something we're going to stuff into the functions model. Pragmatism is part of the temperaments model. When we define things smartly so that the models actually align with each other so we can engage in a coherent process of triangulation. And so I would say when I talk about like people are more than three-dimensional, but let's say three-dimensional, that we want to have like different ways to arrive at the person. It's sort of like the blind people and the elephant, and one person says, this is a tree, another person says this is like, no, it's like a telephone pole, another person says this is a canvas. It's not that they're all correct, by the way. They're actually all wrong because they all said, none of them said elephant. But when we can collate that data from different perspectives and we collate it in a coherent way, then we can triangulate down to what is the person's best fit type. And there's also the developmental piece, and I believe that's also something we want to account for in our triangulation process. And that's what I mean. Yeah. And I hope, I see so much stuff that's on the internet is just functions, and I love the Jungian functions. I think that's great, and I understand why people are doing it. But I'm like, please remember that there are affective and cognitive aspects of the human experience which are like being cut out completely. And if you want to actually like get at your type, then like do some more thorough stuff and engage in a best fit type process.
Okay. Did you ever get into socionics at all, or?
I've had the benefit really of sitting in on some, you may know Ben. I don't know if you know him in the Northern England.
I watched him a little bit, but I don't watch him that
I know
much.
some of those, and sometimes I'm just a listener, and I hear what like Victor in Kiev has to say. By the way, Victor's piece, the one that he did on the quadra, is like amazing. That, I think every single person in the MBTI community needs to listen to that.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of videos of Viktor Gulenko because Model G, Model A, he's the Model G guy. Model A is easier to get information on in English, but it's just different approaches to the same thing. Like you talk about like the SJ, the NT, and the NF, and that way of approaching it, and then you have the quadras. Like I think just in my personal experience, quadra seems to align more with real people, and then you have what I've seen him talk about as holders of pure type and development. So it is more developmental orientated, leaving more room for differences. So, but of course, you have like the interaction styles and all that stuff. That has also been beneficial to me. Like there's many ways to look at it.
Yeah, so, yeah. I really like, it's before I became aware of Victor's work, Linda Behrens was working on what she called cognitive styles, and now she's changed like to some other label like intentional styles or something that fits with corporate America. I call them growth styles. And they're the 4 categories that match with the quadra. But she hasn't made progress with that in the same way that Victor and the socionics people have, because they've been spending a long time on it. No, and by the way, I have to say that some people were hoping in like 2011, 2012, when people, I published my first book on the neuroscience of personality, people were like, oh, you can move at this right away and it proves type and this and that. I'm like, no, this is like a kickoff. This is the like kickoff to a football game, except this football game is 10 years long. And then after 10 years, we'll be ready to explore in like a really systematic way. But I'm like, you got to give me 5 to 10 years just to like gather more data and do anything more than a pilot study. And I really believe like time, it takes time. It really does. The challenge with socionics is that the definitions of feeling and sensing functions tend to be somewhat different than in the myers-briggs approach. I think they're just emphasizing different things from Jung's work, but that can create some challenges. So I think it's important to remember they are different models or like different takes.
Yes.
And that a person could end up as, like ISFJ in one model and ISFP in the other model. And that's just a consequence of models having different definitions.
That's true. However, for most people, it ends up the same, but not for everyone.
Yeah. So is there, maybe we should go to like a last question or something?
Yeah, I have one question that was like a thought I saw. You were talking about you have that exercise where you have people write their name, like with both hands, and that's a differentiator between sensing and intuition. Why does that work as a test for that?
Well, I haven't been doing that for a long time, so I don't know if it's held up, but I do remember it created a lot of memorable moments. I like it for two reasons. One is because it's a reminder of what kind of model type is, that it is a preferences or role-oriented model. I use both hands all the time, but they play different roles. So if here we go. Here's a good example. And yes, by the way, one does need a centenlation in Norway, as I discovered. So I'm holding with one and unscrewing with the other. So they're playing different roles, and type is beautiful in the way it brings that. Then Isabel Myers came up with this example exercise of people, you say, like, sign your name. People naturally, without even asking, go and they use their preferred hand, and they sign their name. And then she says, okay, now you can sign your name again using your other hand. And then that brings a whole bunch of things about how well is the other hand developed. What about the assumption, I didn't ask at the beginning which hand I should use. So it highlights a lot of different important elements about type. And I thought, why not just throw that in there to see what happens? And I observed, at least when I was running stuff in the lab at UCLA, that the people who showed more activity doing with their non-preferred hand tended to be intuiting types. And why was that? Is that more difficult for them? Is it more engaging for them? I began to tease out this idea that it's more engaging. There's this concept of like, there's this hypothetical, what if I could develop my other hand? Like, what would that be like? And I just remember one time in ESTP, who actually he became an assistant for me and like all these things, and like really had a chance to go through best of type process. And in fact, all the people in the lab did. And he's like, well, why would I get a lot of effort to this? Like, I don't need to do this in everyday life. So what does it matter? And I thought that was very telling. Of course, somebody with intuiting preference could be like, oh, ha, 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 like it doesn't matter. So this is not a rule-based thing. It's a statistical thing. The reason I didn't keep looking at it is because the time frame used to measure it is very short. It only takes 5 seconds at most for a person to sign their name, and then to sign with their non-preferred hand, again, maybe 10 seconds. 30 seconds is not really... I would need to run controlled studies that accounted for other things in order to look at that level. And that really gets into like a technical aspect of EEG. Like the reason I look at people for so long is not just to have them do different tasks, so that stuff that are confounding variables gets washed out. But when we're trying to run something that's really short period of time, then we need to really eliminate a lot of confounding variables. And I'm not in the business of just publishing a paper on how people sign their name and what happens with that. So that was an activity which I still ask people to do, but I don't really, I haven't looked at it in detail because it's not the kind of thing that I can properly assess. But it still is neat. It's, and I do see the differences anecdotally in the way people solve problems differently. I remember an ISTP came into the lab and I would give her, she worked in the math problems. Actually, her brain activity remained very sort of low and steady. What changed as she got from easy problems to hard problems, because that's how it's structured. You start with 2 + 2, and then they get more difficult until calculus. And she simply, most people, they try and move at the same pace through the problems, but they up the amount of brain activity. It doesn't matter what type, that's how people tend to do it. There's a lot of people who are on easy mode until they suddenly get to a hard question, and then they switch modes. And they're like, oh, okay, the questions are starting to get hard now. Let me put on my thinking hat. And so there's that kind of switch. And then the other one, she was a great example, which was unusual, is that she just kept the same low level of activity. She simply spent a lot longer on each problem as they got harder. So she expended time rather than brain activity. And I thought that that was an interesting trade-off. Whereas I know as like INTJ, I'm probably going to view time as very valuable. And so I'm going to expend brain energy and simply try and think harder and keep working towards like some imagined, well, I tell them they have 3 minutes. And they don't have to solve everything in 3 minutes. It's not a real deadline, but I know especially for TJ types, that creates a sense of urgency to mention time. And they'll be just like, working. So there's really interesting things like that, which I think within my body of research will remain anecdotal. And I will leave it to some future person to sort of like say, let's do a little study on that and pull that out. Because, I feel a karmic obligation to finish what I started. And I know I feel the pain at times that people place on me and my research. As if somehow I'm like a type messiah. And that's Dario was proof type. Like, no, I didn't prove type. I provided supporting evidence. I think I painted a more nuanced picture of type. I reminded people of development, but I do feel a need to follow through. I can't stop here. I need to go to a point where it's like enough data and enough subjects and enough analysis that creates something that's like has substance to it. Truly, this is not just pilot study. And then after that, I have other actually big interests in life, and then would like to not leave type behind because I love all of this stuff, but leave it to other people to do. And I think eventually the technology will allow that to happen, as it becomes cheaper and more available and so on.
Okay, that pretty much answered that part too. That was like the last question I was gonna ask you. And you just filled it out.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for talking to me about this.
Yeah, my pleasure. And for all of those who are listening or watching, thank you for getting all the way through this. And stay tuned in the next few years to see what happens with type and neuroscience.
All right, that was good.
Yeah.